Hello everyone, how you doing? Welcome back. I am Kris. I just saw this come out a day ago this is Kings and Generals. I don't know if you know the channel. I'm just guessing it's them. This is the real reason behind the American Civil War. Go ahead and click that thumbs up. If you could do that for me, that helps tremendously. Subscribe to the channel if I've done anything that you find entertaining enough to come back to. I don't know why you would subscribe to begin with then. And you can donate to the channel through the thanks button. If you do donate and you request a video, your name will be sponsoring that video. All right? So, I've never heard of the Civil War. So let's get into it. It's a joke, by the way.
On April 12, 1861, South Carolina troops opened fire on federal forces in Fort Sumter, initiating the American Civil War. 4 years and 2 million casualties later, the North would stand triumphant over a broken and devastated South. What drove the southern slaveholding states to war is simultaneously complicated and extremely simple. Numerous disputes and confrontations had threatened the union between the states since independence. However, the only issue that the democratic process failed to overcome was slavery. Ultimately, it was the fear-driven need to preserve the institution of slavery that caused the American Civil War. There was no doubt of this at the time. There should be no doubt now. Welcome to the introduction to our new series on the American Civil War, where we will discuss the lead-up to the deadliest war in American history and discuss the causes that led to it. Spoiler alert, it was slavery. When you march to war, you leave behind certain securities of everyday life, but these days there's at least one you can take. Special deal in conditions you have VPN separately. You regional foreign region quite a lot VPN thanks to generals. The eminent Civil War historian James M. McPherson describes slavery as the basic and most deep-rooted cause of the Civil War, a stance with which we wholly and unequivocally agree. While the immediate cause of the war was Southern secession and numerous other issues exacerbated tensions, the proximate cause was slavery. Absent that peculiar institution, there would have been no Civil War. However, you shouldn't take historians' word for it, for the Confederates' own words agree with them as well. The Confederates were quite open about slavery being their reason for revolt. In personal letters, church sermons, newspaper articles, and even their founding documents, the Confederates repeatedly stated that maintaining slavery was the entire reason for secession. The second line of Mississippi's Declaration of the Causes for Secession states that our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world.
I just want to say this. I've always said it's about slavery. I know some people say states' rights, blah, 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 blah. Fine. If they just admitted that it was about slavery, I'll come back to that. But if they just admitted, yes, it was about slavery, then I think it alleviates a lot of the, what was it about? What was it about? It was about slavery. The founding documents say that. So if we can just get past that, and you want to say states' rights for what? Well, to own slaves. Fine. If we can just get past that part, then I think that we could all come together a little better. But when I said I'm going to put a pin in that, understand that if my family was from the South and my family dating back were slave owners, I would be upset that someone from the North was saying, your family was slave owners, you're disgusting, you're terrible, you're this, you're that, because I have nothing to do with that. They did. Whether I agree with what they did or not is different. Clearly, I wouldn't agree with it, but that's my family. And I would be hurt by that. Yes, to have my family degraded like that. And clearly, they would be degrading human beings, but I would feel insulted. But I would also feel insulted that people are blaming me You're guilty. You're responsible. You owe us this. You owe us that. When I had nothing to do with it. And I'm not living off of some foundational wealth. I'm not living off some foundational wealth that my family got from slavery. Like, I'm not sitting back with my feet up just enjoying life because my family made so much money off of slaves. You know what I'm saying? I think that this is just something, if we could just stop with the lost cause, stop with this, stop with states' rights, and just agree it was slavery, then so much of this fighting we could just move past it. And we could start saying, look, mistakes were made. The North and the South, mistakes were made. And we can stop bickering over this, and we can start looking at the issues that caused it, because that is just as important and just as responsible as the war itself. We can say the North was guilty, the South was guilty, and this was the head. And you could take it all the way back to the founding fathers who refused to deal with it because people like Jefferson and everyone said, we got you a country. Now it's your job to settle all these other things. It just puts a lot of responsibility on the next, and it's not fair for the next to have to deal with things that the previous generation should have dealt with. But I digress. Let's get back into the video.
It then proceeds to lay out 17 grievances regarding the threat to slavery by free states, before declaring, "We must either submit to degradation and to the loss of our property worth 4 billions of money, or we must secede from the union framed by our fathers to secure this as well as every other species of property." The original seceding states, who made their own declarations, had the same grievances and drew the same conclusion, though far less concisely. The Confederate Constitution was similarly clear about defending slavery. It was mostly copied from the US Constitution, except for adding protections for slavery and restricting internal improvements.
Sorry. I'm going to pause this video real fast, and I'll come back. My dog has to go potty. All right. Sorry. I'm going to go back a little bit. Okay. Back to the video.
The Confederate Constitution was similarly clear about defending slavery. It was mostly copied from the US Constitution, except for adding protections for slavery and restricting internal improvements. Article 1, Section 9, Line 4 of the Confederate Constitution states, "No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed," while Article 4, Section 3 specifically allows slavery in any new territories. In defending this constitution, the Confederacy's Vice President Alexander H. Stephens explicitly confirmed that the Confederacy was specifically created to defend slavery. In his famous Cornerstone speech, he states, "The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution." He further asserted that contrary to the Declaration of Independence proclamation that all men are created equal, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Throughout the speech, Stephens blatantly and unequivocally rejects all American founding principles which could threaten the institution of slavery. He made no effort to hide the truth that the South was seceding to continue the enslavement of Africans. Confederate President Jefferson Davis preferred to be more guarded about secession's causes, and always couched them in terms of property rights. However, he never publicly disagreed with Stephens, and no evidence exists that he did so privately. In fact, it's quite clear from his words that he had the exact same sentiments as Stephens. In his farewell address to the Senate, he repeatedly defended the idea that Africans were inferior and deserved to be slaves, as in the Constitution, we find provision made for that very class of persons as property. They were not put upon the footing of equality with white men. In a speech to the Confederate Congress, he celebrates their freedom from a persistent and organized system of hostile measures against the rights of owners of slaves in the southern states, ensuring abolitionists wouldn't be thus rendering the property in slaves so insecure as to be comparatively worthless, and thereby annihilating in effect property worth thousands of millions of dollars. Overall, it can be seen that there was never any ambiguity or dissension. The southern states openly seceded in order to continue the chattel slavery of Africans, and they trumpeted that fact to everyone. This leaves the question of how there came to be any ambiguity or dissent over the Civil War's causes, when those behind the war were so open about what was happening. There are two reasons. The first is a lack of focus on slavery from legitimate scholarly sources. Early historians who wrote about the Civil War did not see the need to write about slavery. That slavery was the primary cause of the war was considered a settled point. Thus, most scholars focused on untangling the web of other contributing causes and let slavery fall to the side. After all, there's little academic need to write about established facts when there's obscura to be investigated. This lack of focus created a perception that slavery was less important to the conflict than it truly was.
And Lincoln could never say, as he said, if I can save the Union by freeing every slave, I will. And if I can save the Union by freeing zero slave or freeing none of the slaves, I will. He wanted to just preserve the Union. Slavery issue was a side note, but he couldn't say, he was an abolitionist to an extent, more quiet than he was other people in his cabinet. But he couldn't say, you want to secede? Fine. We'll fight you, and we're going to make sure that slavery is abolished. He couldn't say that. And he couldn't say that because not everyone in the North was abolitionists. There was slavery in the North. Not as much, but there was. If he would have said that, he would have lost everything. He would have had very few states. He would have lost New York, Maryland. In terms of northern, I don't know if Pennsylvania had them at the time. Trying to remember. I don't. But anyways, he couldn't have said it would have been crushing to anything he would have done. So he also couldn't start the whole fight with we're gonna end slavery. No, wouldn't have worked.
Another reason that slavery fell to the wayside in Civil War historiography was deliberate obfuscation by the Confederates themselves. Having lost the war and facing the judgment of history, they sought to distance themselves from their indefensible championing of slavery. In a post-war diary entry written while imprisoned and in subsequent correspondence, Confederate Vice President Stevens claimed that his extemporaneous cornerstone speech was misquoted and miscopied by a reporter, and that the real issues were constitutional questions over states' rights. His claim is undercut by his other claim that the misquotes occurred despite consulting with the reporter after the speech, suggesting that Stevens is responsible for his own misinterpretation. More damning, Stevens was an avid letter writer and newspaper contributor, yet never mentioned being misquoted nor offered to correct the record before his incarceration. Davis would similarly change his tune, claiming that the war had been fought for the inalienable right of a people to change their government, and the right to withdraw from a union into which they had, as sovereign communities, voluntarily entered. Slavery was incidental to that issue, a complete reversal of everything both men had said prior to the war and everything their own state's secession documents said. credible historians dismiss Davis and Stephen's obfuscations as self-serving and blatant falsehoods. This myth-making was aided by the work of Jubal Early. Acting on what he believed were Robert E. Lee's final orders to his troops, Early sought to romanticize and celebrate the Confederacy as a noble lost cause in numerous articles for the Southern Historical Society and newspapers in the 1870s. These works, coupled with other former Confederates' memoirs, created a mythology to protect the South from the bitter reality of what it had done and the unjust institution it had fought to preserve.
And I think a lot of that also comes from some of the people who fought in the Civil War, and then the children of those people who fought in the Civil War for the Confederates. You don't want your father, uncle, brother slandered negatively. You don't want it to have been fighting about slavery. You would rather it be states' rights, your ability to do this. Don't you think that you have the right to do? It's so easy to try to change it. Again, it's just something, if we can just get past it and accept that that's what it was about. We can, once that's accepted, then we can move on to other things. Like I said, we can focus on the reasons behind why it even got to that point. Let's do that instead of fighting over, well, no, states' rights, it was this. Let's just move past that and just move on to the other issues, because everyone's at fault. Both sides, North, South, Democrat, Republican, slaveholder, non-slaveholder, doesn't matter.
This didn't fool anyone post-war.
And it goes all the way back to the founding of the country, where people should have done something instead of kicking that proverbial can down the road.
As Union General George H. Thomas noted in 1868.
By the way, he was a great general. George Thomas, very underrated.
The greatest efforts made by the defeated insurgents since the close of the war have been to promulgate the idea that the cause of liberty, justice, humanity, equality, and all the calendar of the virtues of freed men suffered violence and wrong when the effort for Southern independence failed. This is, of course, intended as a species of political cant, whereby the crime of treason might be covered with a counterfeit varnish of patriotism so that the precipitators of rebellion might go down in history hand in hand with the defenders of the government, thus wiping out with their own hands their own stains. All in all, the dedicated efforts of lost causes enabled post-war Southerners to blur slavery's importance to the war, but there was no true doubt then, and none should remain. The exact reasons why the South was willing to fight were as complicated and simple as why slavery was the cause. Historians agree, and Confederate rhetoric corroborates, that fear drove Southerners to rebellion. Exactly what those fears were, and which were most important, is still a source of considerable debate.
Most of the fear was because they assumed Abraham Lincoln was going to come into office and remove their slaves. And Lincoln came out so many times and said, I'm not doing anything. But he put people in his cabinet that certainly were not pro-slavery. And I think that was what was looked at as he's trying to end what we know, what our system of living, if you're the South. And I get that. But they started the war, I believe, before he was even inaugurated. I'm sorry, they seceded before he was inaugurated. So I mean they were starting before, and they didn't even know his reasoning. Know what he was going to do, sorry.
But three of them stand out. The most visceral fear was of the slaves themselves. This may sound absurd, but as Thomas Jefferson eloquently observed in 1820, slaveholding is like holding a wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Slave owners lived in perpetual fear of slave uprisings, and with good reason. Many of the richest slave owners were classically educated and familiar with Spartacus and the Roman servile wars. They drew parallels between themselves and those ancient Italian slave owners who had been cut down by their slaves. More pressingly, the Haitian Revolution, which happened only a few decades before the American Civil War, was still fresh in everyone's memory. The brutality and cruelty of that conflict were bad enough, but far worse for the southern slaveholders was the 1804 massacre of surviving French citizens on the island. Southerners, even those who didn't personally hold slaves, feared suffering the same fate if they lost control of their slaves. Demographics made this fate seem highly plausible.
That's like me going and getting a bunch of tigers and then putting them in my yard, in my backyard, with a big fence, because I want to protect the other people. But then I walk amongst them and I remember, oh yeah, they're wild tigers. This is not smart. When you buy another human being, well, first off, when that human being is smuggled and then bought and forced to work for your plantation in a whole new country, or even born into this situation, you are expecting something from someone. They're not a pair of scissors you just go and buy. They're not a butter knife. They're not a lawnmower. These are people who have the same life expectancy as you would have. They need the same things to keep themselves going. They need air, they need water, they need food. A butter knife could live forever, not a person. You cannot have someone owned as property and then not understand why that person's looking at me like they really want to kill me. I wonder why. If it's so completely okay, slavery is fine, then put your kids up for slavery. Allow your children to be put in that same system. And hey, give your kids up. Give your wife up. No, you're not going to do that. What, are you better than that? No, you're not.
According to the 1860 census, the United States population was approximately 31 million, of which about 4 million were slaves. The free population in the states that formed the Confederacy was about 5.5 million, with about 3.5 million slaves. South Carolina and Mississippi had more slaves than free citizens, which was a contributing factor in those states being the first two to secede. In the event of a widespread, dedicated revolt, state governments feared they would lack the manpower to put down the rebellion. Worse, the North might simply watch the rebelling slaves exact just retribution and do nothing, which certain firebrand abolitionists certainly advocated. In the slaveholders' minds, releasing their slaves from servitude could only end in disaster, even as they encouraged the slave population to grow. There had already been a number of localized slave rebellions which had been defeated more by luck and by the rebels' mistakes than any competence on the Southerners' behalf. The Southerners foresaw an oncoming disaster of their own making, which an indifferent North might allow. However, they needed slavery too much to make any choice but to hold on as long as possible. A related fear was the loss of political power. Freeing the slaves would mean giving the black man the right to vote, and even if things didn't turn violent, the sheer number of former slaves would be a threat at the ballot box. Southern whites feared newly enfranchised black voters taking political power away from whites and possibly using it to oppress them as they'd been oppressed. A more immediate fear was their states losing relevance. The South was rapidly losing power to the North and West, and it feared that soon the other regions would simply stop caring about their needs and push their own agenda. The slaveholding states had agrarian economies that depended on a favorable balance of trade and low industrialization to be profitable. However, both the North and West were rapidly industrializing and were looking for increased government spending on infrastructure and protective tariffs. Given that most immigrants were moving to the north and west, it was only a matter of time before non-Southern interests dominated national politics. It was already clear in 1860 that the so-called slave power was dying. 9 of the first 15 presidents were Southerners, and the ones from the North had relied on Southern votes to win their elections. However, when Abraham Lincoln handily won the Electoral College, despite not even being on the ballot in much of the South, it was clear that the slave states were now in the minority, which was unlikely to ever change since few areas west or north of Texas were suitable for cotton production and therefore slavery. This economic bottleneck was a key Southern problem. The antebellum South was utterly dependent on slavery. Ever since they were first settled, the economies of the southern states had been built around agriculture, with large plantations being the economic capstone. This system was nearing collapse in the 18th century due to the falling prices of southern cash crops and the devastation of its soil. Eli Whitney's cotton gin changed everything. Cotton was native to the South and grew well even in depleted soil, but cultivation was minimal due to the seeds being extremely hard to remove by hand, limiting production to 1 pound of cotton per day per worker. Gins, which had existed in India and China for several hundred years but never made it west, easily sorted the seeds from the fiber and could process 50 pounds of cotton per day. Meanwhile, Britain was in the throes of the early Industrial Revolution, built around its textile industry. Thus, at the same time that the South began bringing cotton cultivation online, Britain developed an almost insatiable appetite for cotton. This turned cotton from a pesky weed into white gold. The South traded cotton at top dollar to British ships at their ports in exchange for British-manufactured goods. This trade was phenomenally profitable for both sides, and by 1860, 57% of US exports were Southern cotton, worth $191 million. This made cotton planters the richest men in America for decades. King Cotton completely rewrote the South's economy.
Most of the southern cotton plantations, they were rich, but it was land rich, cash poor, because they were doing trades. And if they got any money, they were buying up land to do more cotton. So it was a trade-off in a way. They were happy with it, but if it came time to paying off debts, they had to sell land.
And production soared. This system could not exist without slavery. The most profitable type of southern cotton could be harvested up to 7 times a year. Cotton had to be picked by hand, which was unpleasant in the southern heat and dangerous due to the plant's rock-hard and razor-sharp bolls. The profit-maximizing amount of labor was 1 hand per 10 acres, picking 200 pounds of cotton per day. Cotton would readily grow in any warm, humid climate, but it wasn't possible at the time to increase yield per acre. Growing more cotton required more land, which required ever more workers. Luring non-enslaved workers to...
Yeah, that was another thing. You bought more land, you had to buy more slaves. And the trade-off is that, yeah, you're selling more, but you have more mouths to feed, people to clothe. So any money that you had was literally going back to everyone else. And they didn't always feed them great, but didn't take care of them very well. But they did compared to like sugar plantations in Santo Domingo. The name's slipping me. I don't know if that was right.
Such a back-breaking job would have required extremely high wages, all them having literally no other choice. With the American frontier promising limitless possibilities and the rapidly expanding northern factories always hiring, southern planters couldn't compete in the labor market and maintain their profits. Therefore, the lowest cost option was slavery, which was a steep investment up front in exchange for very low maintenance costs over the long run. This resulted in plantation owners pouring money into buying increasing amounts of slaves and land unsuitable for anything but cotton farming. An 1860 estimate suggests that the total value of American slaves was at least $2 billion, at a time when total government revenue was about $4 billion. Almost all Southern wealth was tied up in slavery. By this point, the Southern states were totally reliant on a dangerous economic system. Known alternately as Dutch disease, the resource curse, and a rentier economy, it created a system of dramatic inequality and economic stagnation in which extraction of a high-value resource is so profitable that all other industries struggle to compete. The easy money in resource extraction leaves little incentive to invest in other economic sectors, and so they are left to wither and frequently die. Thus, a rentier economy becomes dependent on the resource, and should that sector decline, the entire economy collapses. This causes an enormous wealth gap between those who profit from the resource and the general population, leading to instability. Most rentier states in the modern world use a combination of violent oppression and social welfare to quash dissent. The slaveholding South certainly used extreme violence to keep the slaves in line, but not the white population. While the cotton economy created a highly privileged class of plantation aristocrats, the vast majority of Southerners were poor farmers. About 25% of Southern families held slaves, but only about 8% had more than 10, and only 0.1% of planters had more than 100 slaves. However, even Southerners who held no slaves heavily supported slavery and the overall Southern economic system. While the reasons for that support are complex and controversial, one important reason was aspiration. In theory, a poor subsistence farmer needed only 1 year's food surplus to switch to cotton growing. The profit from 1 year's cotton harvest would be enough to start buying slaves to take over the work. Once slaves were working the land, wealth came quickly and exponentially. How often this actually happened is hotly debated, but it was at least theoretically possible. Thus, the allure of being an elite planter was enough to keep the majority invested in the system. A common talking point of the lost cause myth is that if slavery was the issue which caused the war, why didn't other nations have one to end slavery? All the New World empires were built on slavery, and they peacefully emancipated their slaves, so it can't be the main reason America fought itself. However, this ignores the unique aspects of emancipation in those empires. Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, which provided for the gradual emancipation of slaves outside of India over the following 10 years. This was accompanied by slaveholder compensation of £20 million, roughly 40% of the government's budget. This compensation quelled most dissent, which was already limited because slaveholders in the British Empire held less political sway than American slaveholders did. Moreover, members of the British Parliament were elected by voters in Britain proper, where slavery had never been legal, and few politicians had reason to ally with slaveholders beyond limited commercial interests. Thus, slavery could be and was abolished without significant political backlash. A better comparison is Brazil, which didn't outlaw slavery until 1888. The slaveholders there had very similar fears to the Americans and had resisted ending slavery until the entire plantation system was beginning to fail. The final end came by imperial decree, almost on a whim, and directly contributed to the fall of the monarchy the following year. Without the American Civil War, it is probable that the United States would have followed Brazil in allowing slavery to continue for the benefit of the politically powerful slaveholding Southern elite. As it was, their desperation to maintain the system triggered the war that caused their downfall. It could not be any clearer that slavery was the powder keg that set off the American Civil War. In the next episode of this series, we will discuss the opening stages of the seminal showdown between North and South. To make sure you don't miss it, please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our video.
That was really good. I'm really looking forward to part 2. I wonder how many of these they'll make. I think they did 8 of the Revolutionary War, which I haven't uploaded all those, but I've gotten a couple more to go still. Kings and Generals is a great channel. They keep wanting me to work for them, but I'm like, no, come on, guys. I'm busy. Got a karate tournament, so I can't. It's not true. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll cover part 2, definitely. But until then, have a good day, have a good night.